Hi all, welcome to another installment of American history. Today we're going to look at the bit following, or part of what happened following the 1850 Compromise. We're looking at the rise of abolitionism, in particular in literature, and the reaction to this, again, particularly in literature. So we're looking at the time frame 1850 to 1854. I'll do some other videos looking at some of the more the political aspects and other elements of this, but in this we're particularly looking at kind of the cultural and social reaction, and it's quite an interesting topic. It's quite intriguing things that happen with literature, but also it's really significant in terms of us giving us an insight into how the American people in both the North and the South feel about issues at the time. Though there is a chance that the literature kind of exaggerates the actual feelings amongst the people. And whilst there is abolitionist literature, this doesn't mean everybody in the North is an abolitionist. However, the perception of some in the South is that everybody in the North is an abolitionist because there is abolitionist literature. So we kind of come out of the 1850 Compromise, and particularly one part of the 1850 Compromise, which was the Fugitive Slave Act, and there's some details of that on screen. And essentially, it could turn all Northerners into slave catchers. They could be raised as part of a posse to capture slaves, not only newly escaped slaves, but slaves who'd been living in their community for long periods of time. There was some really kind of controversial stuff in this, which kind of suspended jury trial for it. The alleged former slaves' testimony was not really taken into account according to the way the law was written. So there was a lot of stuff that was deeply controversial about this. The fines were particularly large, and there was also the chance for imprisonment for failing to comply with it. It's caused great anger in the North, and above where you can see me speaking is some details of some of the stuff that was going on. So northern states had passed personal liberty laws to try and take the edge off, or to try and nullify, in effect, the fugitive slave law. Again, this then causes huge anger in the South. There's the Underground Railroad network, which is a series of kind of safe houses and trails and things to try and help slaves escape, and then ultimately to help former slaves escape then through the northern states and up into Canada. And in the final months of 1850, about 3,000 former slaves moved out of the northern states of America and into Canada. One of the most kind of famous events surrounding reacting to fugitive slave law was the Boston mob breaking into a courthouse and killing a guard in an attempt to rescue the fugitive slave Anthony Burns. Burns was returned back into slavery, but his freedom was then bought by the people of Boston. So there is a great deal of controversy around this act. So that's kind of our context, and this now takes us into the literature. Right, the most famous bit of abolitionist literature from this time, and very much a reaction to the injustice of the fugitive slave law and to the horrors of slavery as a whole, was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, first of all, is published as a series over, I think it's about 40 parts in a publication known as the National Era, which was an abolitionist publication. Didn't have a particularly large readership at that point. When things change is when it's actually released as a novel in 1852. And in its first year alone, it sold over 300,000 copies in the US. The publisher struggled to keep up with demand. There were various kind of special editions published with lots of illustrations, and it sold really widely. In fact, it sold almost as well in the UK as it did in America, and it sold elsewhere as well. And so we see it selling in large numbers then through the rest of the 50s, from 1852 onwards. And in the end, it sells over 1 million copies. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author, was the daughter of a famous preacher who'd been part of the Second Great Awakening, and where we saw this kind of new kind of moralistic stream in the US, and she was said at most, and reports on this do vary, at most have visited a plantation once, and some accounts or some studies on it suggest she never visited a plantation at all. So there were questions raised in the South immediately about the validity of what she was writing, because she wasn't doing it from first-hand experience. And so the claim was, this is a northern abolitionist, she doesn't know what's going on. Now, she did do her research, and a lot of what she wrote was based on abolitionist literature. In particular, the life story of a former slave called Uriah Henson, who kind of written a narrative of his life, and Harriet Beecher Stowe kind of said that she had taken a lot of inspiration from that. I mean, as a modern piece, well, looking at this piece of literature from a modern point of view, it does contain kind of numerous kind of fairly negative racial stereotypes, and though maybe enlightened for its time, would not be considered to be enlightened in the modern day. So very much of its time. Probably almost as famous as the book itself is this quotation that I've got on the slide. So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. It's something that is supposedly said by Abraham Lincoln to Harriet Beecher Stowe when they met in 1862. Historians are divided on whether he actually said those words, but it makes a good story. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, it sells. It's got an emotional story in it. It touches on the fugitive slave law, which is a huge issue in the North, even if abolitionism isn't necessarily. Stowe, who writes it, is an abolitionist. Now, it's not read by everybody in the North. It's read by a large number of people, but it's not necessarily the case that everybody who reads it either is or becomes an abolitionist. But we start to see the stirrings of that movement, and this is reaching an audience that other abolitionist literature isn't. Other abolitionist literature tends to be read by the small group of abolitionists who already exists, and are circulated amongst the Black American population in the North. And so this is kind of reaching into an area in society which other abolitionist literature hasn't been. It's getting into the houses of people, it's getting into the minds of people, and it's starting to paint a picture of what the South is like, which is reinforcing a negative portrayal of the South within the North. Right, so the South aren't particularly happy with this, to say the least. Now, there are a number of reactions. So, as we go back to the previous slide, so Uncle Tom's Cabin is a reaction to the fugitive slave law. We then get a reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this is our second reaction. And the reaction here is one of anger. So one of the formats this anger takes is it's really, again, really quite an interesting thing to happen. It actually creates a whole genre of literature. And these are known as anti-Tom books or anti-Tom literature. And I've got some examples on screen now of this. So the Sword and the Distaff, also referred to as Fair, Fat and 40. Auntie Phyllis's Cabin, or A Southern Life as It Is, and The Planter's Northern Bride. Now, all of them try and portray the South in a very different way, in particular trying to put across a far more positive picture. So the Sword and Distaff, probably the most widely read of any of these, it tries to portray this positive picture of a slave owner, and it's getting across this idea of the slaves are actually being better treated and happier than northern workers. And there's a slightly oddly named Captain Porgy, who is the slave owner, and against all struggles and everything, he works really hard in looking after his slaves and protecting them from people who might take his estates and things off him. Auntie Phyllis's Cabin, A Southern Life as It Is, went under two different titles, different times, is very much the clear and obvious direct attack on Uncle Tom's Cabin. Obviously very derivative in its title, or And then what we've got here is something that's selling 20,000 copies in 1832. So we're talking at most a tenth of the circulation of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the same year. It is a very unsubtle response to Stowe's novel, and it claims again how really happy slaves are. So quite clearly nonsense. Probably the most interesting one, I think, of these is one called The Planter's Northern Bride. It's written by Caroline Lee Hentz. It's published in 54, so it's a little bit later. Now, interestingly, in terms of the way the story goes, which is about a planter's bride coming down from the north and having her mind changed about the southern way of life when she actually lives in and experiences the south, it's Hentz herself was a northerner. I think she was born in Massachusetts, and she moves down to the south. Similar stories, almost to the one in the novel. She was an established author already, writing novels about life in the South. This is the first time when she actually directly feels the need to defend the Southern way of life, and particularly to talk about slavery in any way. And interesting, the bad guys in her book are the abolitionists, who are these kind of evil troublemakers. So we see this whole genre. Now, none of them sell in the same numbers, but it does show a kind of a need within the South to react. Now, most of the anti-Tom literature is written by white women. Again, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote Uncle Tom, a white woman. So again, it's quite an interesting way of looking at the area of society and where this debate is being had, and shows that kind of a wider kind of cultural society view on abolitionism and reaction to it, other than just looking at the kind of the great man kind of history, when you're just looking at the politicians and what's been said in Congress and things like that. Right, so we then get another type of reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a bit more sinister. There's various stories of kind of threats and attacks. A bookseller in Alabama is kind of chased out of town for having offered Uncle Tom's Cabin for sale. Stowe herself recorded receiving numerous kind of threatening letters regarding her book. The most disturbing one is a particular package which are not only containing threats, also contained what appears to have been the severed ear of a slave. So some really quite kind of gruesome and kind of terrible things with all of this. The sale of the book is actually banned in a lot of southern states, and in a way this almost kind of emphasizes the idea of there's no publicity like bad publicity. The banning of it in the South kind of increases its appeal in the North, and we start to see kind of an oddity in here is in that really there wasn't any appeal of the book in the South. It attacked the Southern way of life. There weren't many Southerners who were going to go out and buy it. Some of those who had been buying it to burn it in kind of public demonstrations against the book. And again, so I guess a sale's a sale, but the banning, again, it seems to be an overreaction, and maybe showing a kind of an underlying paranoia or oversensitivity in the South about abolitionism. The numbers of abolitionists, again, I'll state again, are quite small at this point. Quite what danger abolitionist literature would pose to the South is unclear. The southern states had already got laws in place that meant very, very few of the slaves could actually read. Therefore, the idea that they would be reading abolitionist literature and being inspired by it seemed a little far-fetched. And so this starts to maybe think as the scale of the reaction starts to make us think that maybe the Southern reaction is disproportionate. They've misunderstood the popularity and the scale of the sales of the book and abolitionism in the North. Right, so we then get another reaction in the North. So we get kind of we've got these things now bouncing to and fro, and the strength of the Southern reaction starts to make people question things in the North. It reinforces some negative views about the South being violent and it being dominated by this planter class. And one of the big ideas of the early 1850s and developing going through the 1850s and all the way up through to the Civil War itself is this idea of slave power, and this idea of this planter class not only dominate the South, but also increasingly dominate the US as a whole, and with people in the Supreme Court and the White House and in Congress and things like that. So it all kind of feeds into this mistrust between the two societies. Right. So the key question really is why is all of this so important? Why is abolitionist literature and the reaction to it, why does it matter? Well, it matters for a series of reasons. First of all, it's an important consequence. So if you're looking at the fugitive slave law and go, well, what are the consequences of the fugitive slave law? One of the biggest consequences of it is Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that then triggers into this whole reaction to it. So it's part of this bit of the hangover from the 1850 compromise, and one of the reasons why it doesn't fully work. It's also kind of a really important way of us looking into the attitudes in both the North and the South and how they appear to be changing at this point in time. So we can see the kind of anti-fugitive slave law idea in it. We can see the growth of abolitionist ideas in the North, and we can see them reaching new audiences. So that's significant. We can see the way that the South reacts. So we're starting to see almost like a war of ideas developing, where the South feels the need to defend slavery and its way of life as it sees it, and it's rather than seeing what had previously been kind of your 1840s, 1830s kind of thing as this idea of slavery as a kind of a necessary evil. The South is kind of almost fighting on a different footing now and going, no, actually it's better than the methodology that you use in the North. And they would talk about wage slavery, and they would talk about the terrible conditions in northern towns and things, and the way that the slaves were treated differently. And so they really are coming out fighting at this point and going, no, the way that we do things is right, and your immoral attacks on us have no grounding. Now, the political reactions and violent reactions to Uncle Tom's Cabin indicate really that what we're seeing is the South really, really feeling under threat. Because there wouldn't be this degree of reaction if they didn't feel there was some kind of weight of Northern opinion behind the abolitionist literature like Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Northerns, as we see this as proof of the barbarity of the South. So the sectional division is growing. So the story of the abolitionist literature and the reaction to it is kind of an insight into the growing sectional tension, and there are interesting debates on this. So either we can take it on face value and say, look, this is proof of growing sectional tension, and this really gives us an insight into it, or we can say, well, actually, what happens with the literature is a real exaggeration of public opinion. There are some in the South who react really, really strongly because they're really worried about slavery, and they're really worried about abolitionism, and so they react in a kind of really over-the-top way. This gives us this idea of the South being paranoid, and most Southerners probably weren't in that category. It also gives us a kind of an exaggerated view of abolitionism in the North, because yes, this book sells well, and yes, there is other abolitionist literature, and you could go and you could look at various other abolitionist writers and publications and things like that. But can we really measure how much abolitionism was in place amongst the general population? Well, politics at the time would suggest not very much, and the abolitionist groups and any people standing for office aren't doing very well at this point in time. So is it true reflection of society, or is it all a big exaggeration and not really showing us how the majority of people felt? Right, I hope you found that useful. A big thank you for watching. Thank you to Amy for requesting this topic. Hopefully I'll get a lot more requests coming in. So please remember to like, share and subscribe. I shall speak to you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.